Today we're going to be hearing about an Italian astronomer, philosopher, mathematician who had the audacity of suggesting that our universe wasn't just enclosed in this little ball of stars like some giant snow globe. He was a heretic. Hello and welcome to another episode of Boring History. My name is Angela and today we're going to be hearing all about the life of Giordano Bruno. Giordano was born in 1548 in a town called Nola in southern Italy. Incidentally, that's the same town that the Roman Emperor Augustus died in, I think. Anyway, not a lot is known about Giordano's childhood. However, he does share with us one memorable incident from his childhood in one of his works. He claims that one day whilst he was still a baby, he had been left alone. He had been left alone in the room of his house when all of a sudden a great serpent appeared from a hole in the wall. He screamed out for his father, who ran in, followed closely by other members of the household. People started yelling at the snake, trying to scare it away, and other people were like, "No, not the baby, save the baby!" Obviously, Giordano survived, or else I wouldn't be making this video. But what is interesting, and what Giordano had found interesting, is that obviously he had just been a baby at the time, so he wasn't sure if this memory of the snake incident was in fact a memory, or if it had just been a dream. And as he'd been a baby, how could he remember so clearly what had happened and what people had said? But a few years later, when he was a little bit older, he went and asked his father about it, and his father confirmed that everything had happened just as he remembered. Giordano was astonished at the power of his memory, and no doubt this incident became one of the reasons that he became so interested in the workings of memory later on in his career. But for now, let's move on. In 1562, at the age of 14, Giordano went to Naples to study, and amongst other things, he became interested in, I guess you could call it a philosophical trend called Averroism. Now, like all philosophy things, it's a little bit hard to concisely summarize what that is. But essentially, Averroism is this set of thoughts or teachings that were inspired by Aristotle as per the translations and or interpretations by this Muslim philosopher. His name was Averroës. Now, the reason that these teaching or philosophical ideas were a little bit controversial is that they didn't quite match up with the teachings of the church. For example, they thought that resurrection of the dead was impossible, which of course kind of causes some issues when we come to the whole Easter and Jesus story. And I think their works kind of focused around this whole thing called double truths, meaning that one conclusion was reached through philosophy and science, and then the other one through religion. If you happen to be an expert in this field of philosophy, please feel free to leave a better explanation in the comment section down below. But for now, let's get back to Giordano, because even though his philosophical beliefs had led to the beginning of some whispers about heresy, at the age of 24, he was ordained as a priest. He was then sent to the Neapolitan convent to continue his study of theology. He completed the course 3 years later, but he was beginning to question some of the things that were taught and some of the things that were just accepted without question. In fact, he got so annoyed at the illogicalness of everything that he quite openly started discussing some topics which were very obviously heresy. So for example, the belief that maybe Christ wasn't exactly divine. Now, obviously, you couldn't have a priest going around saying all these things, so the church prepared a trial to charge Giordano with heresy formally. Luckily, Giordano got wind of what they were planning and he fled to Rome. This was in February 1576. But whilst in Rome, somebody found some scribbles that Giordano had made in all these forbidden texts, so they knew he had been reading from the restricted section, and Giordano had to run away again. He gave up on being a priest and he just wandered the countryside of northern Italy until in 1578 he reached Geneva. He got a job as a proofreader, pissed off a professor, annoyed another church, and once again, after being arrested and luckily released, he wandered the countryside until this time he ended up in France. Whilst in France, he did try to be absolved by the Catholic Church. So essentially he was like, "Please forgive me." The church was like, no, but how about you start lecturing in philosophy? And so he starts teaching in Paris. Now, during this time, there's all this drama happening between the Catholics and the French Protestants, and apparently the French King, Henry of Bourbon, was actually a fan of Giordano's works, and so he offers him protection. Giordano publishes some works, and in 1583, with the blessing of King Henry, aka a letter of introduction, he moves to London. He was 35 years old. He starts lecturing at Oxford, and he starts coming up with alternatives or slightly expands on the Copernican Theory. Now, in very simplified terms, the Copernican Theory is the theory that the Earth and the planets all orbit around a stationary sun, which granted was a step in the right direction from the previously believed Ptolemaic model, which put the Earth in the center of the universe, but the Copernican Theory still had some flaws. So, for example, they thought that the Earth and all the planets moved in these perfect circles, which of course they don't. They also thought that the universe was finite, so that it was just this big and that's it. Now, all of these flaws in the theory actually mean that Giordano was correct to question some of these teachings. However, the very educated people at Oxford were not a fan of his outlandish theories. How dare he suggest that the universe may be infinite? And so he has no choice but to move back to London. He becomes friends with some important people, such as an Earl and Sir Robert Sidney. Alright, so at this point, we're in London and Giordano has some new friends. Then, in February of 1584, through the connection of his friend, Sir Philip Sidney, he's invited to this meeting of Oxford doctors to discuss the movements of the universe. Actually, I think it was just the movement of the Earth. Close enough. The whole meeting just ends up in this big argument, all because of Giordano's ideas. I mean, how dare he suggest that the Bible should only be used for moral teachings and not as a scientific research tool. But to be honest, Giordano doesn't really care that all these idiots can't understand his reasoning, and he just continues on his merry way and continues to publish work. Towards the end of 1585, Giordano heads back to Paris. But the political atmosphere isn't quite as friendly as it had been, due to some issues between King Henry and the Protestants and some other king that was excommunicated. But true to his character, Giordano doesn't let any of this faze him, and he just continues on saying whatever he wants for the next year or so. He calls out this protege mathematician of the Catholics for being, well, stupid. And worst of all, he dares to say publicly that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle wasn't all that. Now, everybody was a huge Aristotle fan, so this was just one step too far. And once again, Giordano starts wandering around the countryside, this time in Germany. He kind of becomes like a roaming lecturer, and he continues to work on his works and publish some of his ideas. For example, he says that technically it should be possible for all religions to peacefully coexist. In particular, because one super religious person should, in effect, in very simplified terms, be able to understand or sympathize with the beliefs or the drive of another super religious person. Now, beliefs such as this meant that by 1589, at the age of 41, he'd also managed to piss off the Lutheran church in the village that he was staying. Or maybe it was a town. I think it was a town. But this time, instead of straight away going off for a wander, he decides to hang around for a bit, mostly because he's in the middle of completing some works and he really wants to get them done. One of these works was called Mathematical Magic, which almost makes maths sound fun. Almost. Now, the following year, he heads off to Frankfurt to try and get some of his works published, but Frankfurt is like, no, we don't want you here. But he still manages to secure some free accommodation at a convent, where once again he gets to annoy some Protestant priests and religious people with his words. Then, in 1591, this Venetian nobleman sends Giordano an invitation to come back to Italy. Giordano's like, yeah, sure, why not? Weather seems nice, our good friend Henry, whatever his name is the King of France. And there's a chair of mathematics vacant at the University of Padua. And he's like, could it be? Could they want to offer little old me a job? Surely not. But just in case, he quickly whips together some private lectures on geometry and some other hard mathematical stuff for some German students. Just something small he can throw on his resume. He heads off to Italy, but after a year or so of patiently waiting, he realizes that they're not actually going to offer him the position. In fact, they offer it to Galileo. So he goes back to the nobleman in Venice who had invited him to Italy in the first place and gives him some private lessons. However, the nobleman doesn't quite understand how to apply these memorization techniques that Giordano is teaching him, and he's also super annoyed, or perhaps we dare say jealous, at the fact that Giordano is planning on going back to Frankfurt. So, like a spoiled brat, he stamps his foot and he calls up the Venetian Inquisition screaming, "This man is a heretic!" Giordano is arrested and put to trial, and at first it looks as though he might win, but then the Roman Inquisition has him extradited and brought back to Rome, and he's transferred to the Roman prison in January of 1593 at the age of 45. The Roman trial goes on for 7 or 8 years, so he's in prison for 7 or 8 years. And the whole time Giordano is trying to defend himself and show how his theories aren't actually against religion and how they could actually be used in conjunction with religion. And at one point he even just puts up his hands and says, okay, I admit everything I've published up until now is complete and utter nonsense. But nothing seems to be enough for the church, and it gets to the point where Giordano's just like, do you know what? I don't even know what you guys want from me. You're all a bunch of idiots, and I retract nothing. On the 8th of February 1600, Giordano's death sentence is officially declared. Burn the wizard. A couple of days later, on February the 17th, at the age of 52, he's stripped naked and burned alive. The end, I guess. Now, I think that there's actually been a bronze statue erected in the place that he was burned to death, and apparently I think I was reading somewhere that on February the 17th, City Hall places a wreath at his feet. And that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this story. I certainly enjoy stories like this, although they are kind of sad. If you want to read more, I've listed some sources for you down below, and Britannica actually gives a really good summary of everything, including some of his works, so it's worth checking that out as well. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you'll consider subscribing because I look forward to sharing even more boring history with you in the future.